Welcome and thank you for joining this presentation from thinking to Musyawarah-ing. My name is Tanja Rosenqvist and I'm a researcher at RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the words thing and thinking, which are so often used in contemporary design literature to conceptualize what design is and how it's done. And I want to inspire design researchers like yourself to try and look beyond these concepts and look at the many other diverse cultural concepts that are out there that can be used to conceptualize design. As Heidegger, Latour, and today plenty of design researchers have described, the word thing, which we today think of as an object, in ancient Nordic and Germanic societies actually referred to a place where people would gather, but also to the gathering itself. And these things, or in Nordic languages, ting, took place across Scandinavia, northwestern Europe, and UK. So according to the etymology of the word thing, it both means an object, but it also means an assembly or a form of political gathering. And this is, of course, enticing for PD scholars because it helps us understand what design is and what we are doing. If we consider designing as a form of thinking, then design becomes a form of assembling, the creation of social material assemblies, materials and people coming together in these political gatherings. Even though this connection between the thing as an assembly and as an object is really enticing and very useful for design researchers, I suggest that we should remind ourselves of the strong cultural connection this term has to Northern Europe. The thing or the ting refers to a political gathering in this particular context. And the cultural situatedness of the notion of a thing is so important because each cultural context, Northern Europe and Scandinavia included, represents a unique set of democratic ideals. It represents a unique perception of how democratic decision making can and should take place, and therefore also a unique perception of what democratization, this term that's so fundamental to participatory design, what that means in practice. In contemporary participatory design literature, the thing or the ting, for example, is often described as a form of agonistic space, a place where people and things can come together in disagreement and to explore their disputes. But while these concepts of agonism, dispute, and disagreement might be part and productive parts of participatory design processes taking place in Northern Europe, they might not necessarily be appropriate elsewhere. If we look at Hofstede's cultural model, for example, and compare Denmark, a Scandinavian country, and Indonesia, a country that I talk about in the paper, there are significant cultural differences, for example, in terms of the power distance and individualism. And some of these cultural differences can also reflect how democratic decision-making processes are taking place and what is considered appropriate within these cultural contexts. Because of such cultural differences, I suggest that this notion of thing and thinging may be an appropriate way of conceptualizing design in the context of Northern Europe, but it might not be as appropriate elsewhere. I therefore ask the question of which traditional approaches to shared or democratic decision making exist in the other diverse cultural context in which PD takes place. I have looked at some traditional approaches to democratic decision making in the part of the world where I live, in the Asia Pacific region. Through a literature review, I identified four common approaches. Musyawarah is common in Java in Indonesia, Talanoa is common in Fiji and other Pacific Island nations, Bakaul is common in Sumatra in Indonesia, and Hui is common among Maori communities in Aotearoa. Musyawarah is a type of democratic or shared decision-making process in Indonesia, and it always leads to unanimous consensus. Importantly, participants along the way might have to adjust their individual viewpoints to reach this consensus, but throughout the process, it's important within cultural norms to maintain a sense of social harmony. It's important not to show signs of disagreement, which is quite opposite to this notion of the thing as a place of dissensus and where potential disputes can be revealed and negotiated. In Fiji and other Pacific Island nations, such as Samoa and Tonga, Talanoa is a common form of dialogue process that leads to democratic decision making. This, according to literature, is about sharing stories and telling stories and reach a form of consensus by better understanding each other's viewpoints and perspectives. Talanoa, for example, was used by Fiji as part of the COP23 presidency. So, as part of the 2017 United Nations Climate Change Conference, Talanoa dialogue was part of the agenda. Bakaul in Sumatra and Indonesia is also a type of shared decision making. These meetings happen typically before rice cultivation season. Community members come together to reach a consensus regarding how to plant rice, how to irrigate, and how to potentially also harvest. It may include prayer for a good rice season, and it always starts with, as we can see in the picture, sharing a meal, coming together, sitting down, eating together to prepare for what's ahead. And finally, hui is an important type of gathering in Maori communities in Aotearoa. Communities or tribes, Maori tribes, will come together to share stories and debate issues that are of concern to several tribes. And importantly, in the beginning of such an event, the tribes will start by giving speeches and by singing and dancing. And this allows them to assert their identity and to get to know each other better. If you're a rugby fan and you have ever seen the New Zealand rugby team play, you would have seen a game starting with a haka. And the haka is an example of how a hui could start. The participants assert their identity against each other. So, what does this mean for design? Well, in recent design literature, participatory design has been conceptualized as a thing, as a social material gathering. But as I said, this concept of a thing is situated in a particular cultural context. And I suggest that if we conceptualize design as a thing, we may just as well conceptualize it as Musyawarah, Talanoa, Bakaul, or Hui. These are also types of gatherings, social material assemblies where people come together and discuss political matters and political concerns. And if we conceptualize design as a form of thinking, we may also conceptualize design as a form of Musyawarah-ing, Talanoa-ing, Bakauling, or Huing. And this leads to the question, what happens to design when we do this? How might we, for example, design differently? Or how would our view of the design process and the outcome of the design change? Might we analyze design differently? Might we plan and facilitate participatory design differently? So what I'm proposing is that as part of any participatory design project, we ask ourselves the question of which traditional approaches to democratic decision making exist and are important within the design context in which we work. Which democratic ideals underpins it and how does it influence design? And importantly, what do these democratic ideals mean for how democratization can be practiced and enacted through our participatory design process? So as we continue to conduct PD in Northern Europe, in the Asia Pacific, and indeed globally, let's continue to learn about these diverse and culturally specific approaches to traditional democratic decision making, and let's use it to enhance both our practice within these cultural contexts in which we work, but also to enhance PD overall. Finally, I finish by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the beautiful lands where I sit today, the Wurundjeri people. They never ceded this land. I also extend my respect to Indigenous people, Indigenous cultures, and indeed Indigenous governance systems across the world. Thank you for listening.